Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We have a real treat for you, and quite honestly, a real honor for me. This morning, you might have been able to catch an op-ed that I wrote with Reverend Dr. William Barber, the head or one of the co-chairs of the Poor People's Campaign, talking about what this moment really is in our country, and the change in language that we've seen from characterizing workers as service workers to recognizing that they are now essential. That the folks that are stocking our shelves, that are delivering our mail, the nurses on the front lines, the people that are often taken for granted, the child care workers, folks that work in the shadows, yet the workers upon which an entire society and economy are built, and how essential they have become, how we're celebrating them now, yet while we still deny people universal access to healthcare, deny them a living wage, deny them access to affordable shelter. So the op-ed this morning talks about really what this moment needs to be for a call for American leadership to solidify what it means here at home, but also the opportunity that we have to set an example for what we can be, the type of nation we believe we can become. And no one has been more articulate, more energetic, and more just tireless in that effort than Reverend William Barber. I'm thrilled to have him tonight to talk about some of these issues, to talk about the Poor People's Campaign. And if you listen to him, just his call and his enthusiasm for this moment and the opportunity for America to seize that moral leadership is incredibly inspiring. So take a listen and enjoy. Reverend Dr. Barber, I'm so honored and thrilled that you're here tonight. Thank you. And you have been the op-ed that you and I put together today in the Washington Post talks about this shift in language from looking at service workers to now understanding how essential they are to the functioning of our society. But this has been something that you and the Poor People's Campaign have been talking about for a long time and have been fighting for a long time. Just tell me a little bit about how you see this and how you see this moment.
Well, first of all, Congressman, thank you for having the conversation. Thank you for the commitment to put some things in writing that actually speak to this moment and take the courage of speaking to this moment. I was thinking today, my father would have been a contemporary of your grandfather and Dr. King. And my father worked in poverty issues, was inspired a lot by the work of your grandfather and what Dr. King called us to those three evils, poverty, racism, and militarism. And in the Poor People's Campaign, National Call for Moral Revival that we're engaged in now, and through the organization Repairs of the Breach, we talk about five things that prior to this pandemic were critical that we address: systemic racism, systemic poverty, ecological devastation, healthcare, the war economy, and the false narrative of religious nationalism that basically says the only religious things you have to be concerned about in the public square is being for prayer in the school, against gay people, against the woman's right to choose, for tax cuts, and for a particular party, which just doesn't line up, with my values as a Protestant, and it surely doesn't line up with fundamental Catholic social justice teachings. And
Preach.
So, I mean, it's not, I often say, I'm a conservative, liberal, Pentecostal, Protestant. In other words, I try to be Christian. And one of the things I know is Jesus started his ministry talking about the poor, the Patokos, Spirit of the Lord is upon me to preach good news to the poor. He ended his ministry talking about the poor. Nations will be judged now and in the future by how they treat the sick, the thirsty, the hungry, the homeless, the least of these, and interestingly, the immigrant. and so I'm always amazed by folk who want to keep Clark, who have so much to say about what God says so little, and so little to say about what God says so much. But in this moment, it is a transformative moment. Prior to this pandemic, you and I have talked about this. We already had a situation of 140 million people by our numbers. We did a study with the Institute for Economic Policy Studies, several think tanks, economists, because I, a few years ago, was using the federal numbers for poverty too, 39 million. But they said, no, the actual number for poverty and low wealth or low income is 140 million people, 43% of the country. And then they said, and 62 million people work every day without a living wage. And then 80 some million people are either underinsured or uninsured. And then 4 million people get up every morning, can buy unleaded gas and can't buy unleaded water. And then there's not a county in this country where a person working a minimum wage job can afford a basic 2-bedroom apartment.
Yes, sir.
This is before the pandemic. And yet, for the most part, we were stuck in this kind of Reaganomics, neoliberalism, the concept of addressing our country, trickle down, just take care of those up here and the rest will follow. But a pandemic by its very nature exposes the fissures in society. There's a lady at Harvard, Bassett is her name, she's a PhD in public health. And she notes that a pandemic has a biological and a sociological reality. Biological is a germ. We don't have anything to do with that. But the sociological part of it is that it will find the fissures. It's like contrast dye that you put in your body when you're trying to pinpoint exactly what's wrong. And it will show those fissures and it will hang on and live and exploit in the fissures. Well, America has a lot of open wounds. You've talked about them. I've watched you on the floor of Congress, a lot of open wounds when it comes to the criminalization of poverty, when it comes to systemic racism. 140 million people living in poverty and low income, that's 43% of this nation. Before the pandemic hits. And then in the pandemic, oh, and by the way, 700 people were dying a day, according to a study by Columbia University, from poverty and low income. Pandemic hits, and immediately, we can't even use the same language we used to use. I know we can't engage in the same politics because we can't even use the same language. We have to go from people who were in the kind of the missionary work at Sandy Darity at Duke University. He's an economist. He calls it the missionary labor force or the service labor force. Immediately, they become essential. Grocers, fast food workers, truck drivers, nurses aides, doctors, janitors in hospitals, maids, orderlies, childcare, kind of almost the people that we, like sunshine, we accept it every day, but we hardly take time to recognize it. It's a gift to us, right? And so we expect it to be there. But now we found out that these people have to be on the front line and risk their lives every day, even more than the rest of us. And we find ourselves in a place where the pandemic now says, and guess what? Before this pandemic, before I came, you had a chance to make sure these people have living wages, but they don't have it. You had a chance to make sure they have paid sick leave, they don't have it. You had a chance to make sure they have health care, Medicare for all, they don't have it. So now you're putting them on the front lines without the tools to survive in a time of an administration that is grossly inept and inadequately prepared and intentionally divisive. That's where we are.
Reverend, let me just, so you and I could go on for a long time about this, but you're far better at that than I am, so I'm gonna let you keep going. But that shift from service to essential that you articulated so beautifully. And again, we'll put this our op-ed up so folks can take a look at it and some of the statistics that we cite. And you mentioned the ineptness of this administration. So a couple of data points here, right? Food insecurity as of about a week ago in Massachusetts, before the pandemic, was about 19%. It's up to 40%.
Right.
Doubled in about 2-3 weeks. Before the pandemic, the median net worth of a white household in Greater Boston, according to the Federal Reserve, median net worth of a white household in Greater Boston was $247,000. The median net worth of an African-American household was $8. $8. Before the pandemic. The scenario that you just articulated, the only thing I would add to it is we made those choices for those service, now essential workers at a time of economic wealth that we have not seen in this country.
Exactly.
Potentially ever, right? Of economic heights, of records for the stock market.
That's right.
of tax cuts that have flooded, that went disproportionately to the wealthy.
That's right.
And as you said before, what the pandemic shows, you cannot tax cut your way out of this. There is not a gated community with a private school and private police force that is safe from this. Right? So what does that say about the country, though, morally? Right?
Well, Dr. King said any country that let poverty and militarism and war, militarism and racism continue was on a spiral of spiritual death downwards. And he said anybody puts more money into war than they do into economic social level, it was surely on a spiritual decline more.
And so just to push that a second, the Defense Department budget,
that's the point I want to get to.
It's about a little shy of $800 billion.
Exactly. And we know from studies that if we cut it, let's say in half, we'd still have more money than Iran, Iraq, China, and Russia combined. And we are spending like 53 cents of every discretionary dollar into the war economy. It doesn't even all go to the combat because a lot of them are low wealth, low income, and less than 15 cents of every discretionary dollar to education, healthcare, infrastructure. Now, at least I would tell you as a preacher, and I'm nonpartisan, but I'm very political, I've had to challenge both sides of the aisle. And one of the things we've seen since the last time I was in Harlan County, Kentucky, poor Kentucky, Appalachian, Kentucky, because the other piece we have to talk about is prior to the pandemic, something like 28% of white people were poor and low income, but that's 66 million people. 61% of blacks are poor and low income, but that's 26 million people. So the impact of poverty is greater per capita in the black community, concentrated, but the raw numbers actually show that there are more poor and low income white people than there are African Americans. So that's why our campaign goes everywhere. So we were in Kentucky, in Harlan County, USA, poor county. And somebody told me there that the last time, say, Democrats had really been there was when Lyndon Baines Johnson came to have to start the war on poverty. And I thought that was shameful. They said that's one of the reasons half the people don't vote or they vote another way. So here we have this moral situation now. These 5 interlocking injustices: systemic racism, ecological devastation, systemic poverty, the war economy, and this false moral narrative, religious nationalism. And we've had all of this growth, economic wealth. Even I had some disagreements under the Obama administration, but at very least they said, if you increase defense, you're gonna have to increase over here, a dollar here, a dollar there. That was gone immediately. Then we do this $2 trillion tax cut. Some people say the most money transferred from the backs of working people to the wealthy since slavery, right, transferred up. I just read a piece yesterday that said multi-billionaires' wealth went up 10% in the last 30 days during this virus. We know that Naomi Klein talked about and gave us the history of the shock, what she calls it, something like the shock doctrine. And that is whenever America's had crisis, certain people scare the system and draw all of this money in. Over the last 45 days, we've seen trillions of dollars going up, not going to the very place that the public health officials say, if you do not close the gaps and the wounds of racism and poverty, if you do not care for these frontline workers, you really can't ever deal with the pandemic because it exploits, it lives. So while mostly poor people, and I think if we do the data, Congressman, we're gonna find that blacks are having the highest rate of death, but when you look at it economically, it's gonna be poor and low income folk are having the highest rate of death, right? And so if you don't protect those communities and stop it there, you actually make everybody else vulnerable. So the Bible says, since we talk about morality, and I am a bishop and a preacher, there's a scripture in the Bible that says in Isaiah, woe unto those who legislate evil and rob the poor of their rights. The long lines we see, the high death rates we see, the places with no hospitals that closed over the last few years because states didn't accept Medicaid expansion. The people not knowing if they can pay their rent, people working and not getting tested because they're afraid if they get tested and they find out they won't have the health care to get the treatment, are all choices that we made. They didn't have to be.
Exactly.
It didn't have to be. Even the unemployment numbers. I was reading in Germany, what they said was, we're going to reduce the hours of work. The employers will pay a reduced amount, and then the government picks up the rest of the amount. Their unemployment is what? Under 3%, because they chose to invest not in the up here, but in the workers and in salary and in wages. We could be doing the same thing. And so I'm challenging, one of the things I've been saying to even to the Democratic leadership is, we need a bill. And the House can do it, it needs to do it, should have done it. Put it on before McConnell, make them have to vote against it or cut it in front of the people. And before the bill gets passed, do videos of the people, put the face of poverty, the face of the unemployed from Appalachia to Alabama. Put them on there, let the media say, this is who this bill is for. Now, if they want to cut it, then they're gonna have to own that they are willing to stay with trickle-down economics and cut it and hurt these people.
That is the reckoning of this moment, right? The fact that for policymakers, we have to wrestle with the reality, the harsh reality that, as you articulated, the pain that is being felt is reflective of policy choices, right? Policy choices, that our government made choices that has led to, yes, well, the pandemic is something that perhaps nobody could control. Our response to it, obviously, we could, but the consequence of this were a result of policy choices.
Right.
That we also have a choice as to how we choose to come out of this.
Exactly.
That we can choose to ensure that the immigrant not only can get tested, but can get treatment.
We can choose that, right? We
can choose to ensure that the community that I live in, and so Massachusetts, Eastern Massachusetts, has been hit pretty hard by the virus as well. The infection rate in my hometown here in Newton is about 500 people per 100,000. About 500. The state average is about 616 per 100,000. Chelsea, Massachusetts, immigrant community, low-income community, largely Hispanic, but dozens of other languages that are spoken in the community, higher rates of essential workers, higher rates of multi-generational households. The infection rate is nearly 4,000, 8 times higher. And just from cases that we know, right? Not including all of those that we don't. That is also, choices. Yeah, choices. That is also a choice.
So you take that community, then you go to St. John's Parish in Louisiana that had the highest death rate per capita before the pandemic. But it's a Black, poor white community that's in Cancer Alley, that's been suffering because of the decisions to drop carcinogens on those people. It's a form of modern day genocide. Or you go to Holmes County, Mississippi, the poorest county in America, and you go to Chachula, and you have some of the highest rates of death. Those are choices. Those communities have been abandoned. They've been walked away from. And this was before the pandemic. After the pandemic, choices. We haven't put a field hospital there. We haven't made sure they have the PPEs. Go to Appalachia. I have friends up in the mountains, white poor folk, that are scared to death because of what they're saying is, when this thing hits up here, it's gonna wipe us out. And so at some point, a pandemic should make us come together. It should make us find our way. And one of the things about the Poor People's Campaign is we've got Black and white and brown. And let me give you quick 5 things that we.
Yeah, I was going to say, so give us an agenda. So how's the Poor People's Agenda going to fix it? How are you guys planning to address that and mobilize around?
Well, one of the things, on June 20th, 2020, we're having the largest, most historic gathering of poor people, Poor People's Assembly, Mara March on Washington digitally. And we're asking everybody to come in, because it's not going to be me speaking. It's going to be all of these faces, these counterintuitive coalitions coming together, people speaking from their pain, but also laying out an agenda. And we're gonna push to every congressperson, even the White House, to every senator, governors. We're gonna say, tune in and hear the cry of America, because we are very disappointed in the 4 bills that have come out. Because our question is, Where is the guaranteed health care? Where is the living wages? Where is the rent forgiveness for real? Not a kind of rent forgiveness where you get a moratorium for 3 months and then in the 4th month you owe the 3 months plus the 4th month. Well, if you could hardly pay 1 month a month at a time, how are you gonna pay 3 months at one time? So here's what we've said. Number one, we need immediate, comprehensive, and permanent paid sick leave for 100% of the employees for this pandemic, and it must become a standard across all sectors. We need immediate health care for all, including free COVID-19 testing, treatment, and care for all, regardless of income, age, disability, or citizenship. You cannot leave 11 million people untested, untreated, and think you're gonna shut a pandemic down.
And arguably just as bad, test them, say you got it, and then say the treatment, you're on the hook for it.
Right. And what happens is if you test them and then say they're fine, a lot of people are not getting tested. And the reason they're not getting tested, they're saying if it's only a 1 or 2% chance of me dying, I can't go get tested because if I'm found sick or infected, I can't work and I can't afford the health care. We should have done this year. We also want to guarantee basic annual income, direct payments to all low-wage temporary workers for the duration of the crisis, grocery workers, fast food, delivery care. We need a national moratorium on evictions, tax foreclosures, rent hikes, including an immediate halt to encampment sweeps. In the homeless community, we can have millions of people who are on the verge of homelessness. If the virus locks in there, guess what? It's not just gonna hurt them, it hurts the whole society. And the last two things, we need resources to keep all rural hospitals and community hospital centers open. You know, one of the things extremists who call themselves Republicans have done, that's my name, not yours, they spent all this time over the past few years cutting community health centers and cutting money to rural hospitals. So for instance, in the South, we got 75 areas, I think, where the hospitals are just closed now. There are no hospitals within 60 minutes, some places 2 or 3 hours. We need Jubilee debt forgiveness for medical debt, student debt, water facilities, and we must protect our democracy and the right to vote, and we must have permanent protections for Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. We cannot let people use this moment to then come back and want to undermine Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. So these are just some of the things the Poor People's Campaign is laying out.
So tell me a little bit about June 20th.
So June 20th, what we had already been planning, because as we say, 700 people were already dying a day before pandemic. And that's one of the things we got to be careful of too, is some of the language we're using is disingenuous. In other words, yes, there's 700, 800 people are dying a day, had been, from coronavirus, but that's not when people started dying. Columbia University did a study that said poor and low income people were already dying at those levels. And think about it, before the pandemic, 7 people died from vaping. We had a congressional hearing and a White House briefing. 700 people died from poverty and low income. The White House says we won the war on poverty. Sometimes, not you, sometimes Republicans have racialized poverty. Some Democrats have run from poverty and choose to talk about the middle class and the working class. They won't even say the word poor, poverty. So June 20th, we were planning to have this mass meeting on Pennsylvania Avenue because we said two things have to happen. We got to put a face again on poverty. We got to put a face on it, and we got to put a voice with it. And we have to trust the agency of poor people and moral leaders to lift up an agenda from the bottom. We can no longer, our imagination can no longer be limited by this framework that you have to, in this economy, start at the top, and that's who's most important, and the middle, and then come down. If either side is playing into that, whether it's the side that just thinks tax cuts, or it's the side that just believes in neoliberalism, that as long as you help folk up here, that limited framework is the wrong place to start, period. Even outside of a pandemic, biblically speaking, morally speaking, and economically speaking, and constitutionally, if the goal of the Constitution is to establish justice and provide for the common defense and promote the general welfare, then your policy should start from the bottom.
One more. To provide for the ability to pursue happiness.
Yeah, yeah, pursue happiness, right? And that has to mean to me that you can't establish justice if your first concern when you walk in to do a piece of policy is how are we gonna get stuff here, right? You have to start from the bottom. 140 million people. How do we protect them? If they are protected, the rest of society is gonna be okay. If they have money, guess where it's going? Right back into the society.
How do you pursue happiness? Constitutional doctrine.
Right.
How do you pursue happiness if you don't have access to healthcare? If you don't have a home? If you don't have a place to rest your head? If you don't know where food is? If you don't have the ability to educate your child?
Yeah.
Right? You take any of those away from anyone, it's the only thing a parent will think about.
The only thing. And Dr. King once said that the denial of healthcare was the most evil. I'm paraphrasing him now. Because if you're dead, if you can't move, if you're sick and you can't treat it, you can't even fight for the rest of the rights. You can't even go to vote. But here's the other thing, Brother Kennedy. The Poor People's Campaign, we did something counterintuitive. Normally groups expect groups like ours to holler and fuss and not do their data. So we not only did an audit of America, we did a budget.
Mm-hmm.
So we
found
and we have some of the best economists, top ones. I talked to Joseph Stiglitz for a long time. We brought other economists to take, and we said, do a budget. Tell us if this is crazy, and what we found out that doing right, showing mercy and grace is also not only the right thing to do, but it can be done and it can benefit the economy economically.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it doesn't just have to be some pipe dream. You know, if you actually provide health care, it can benefit the whole economy. If you give people living wages, it benefits the whole economy. If you just took one contract, one, not 50, of the defense contracts that go into the Defense Department, just one for 1 year could pay health care for all of the states that denied the Affordable Care Act. Now, you can't tell me that having a pandemic hit you and people can't even get health care, and with all this concern and stress, is not a matter of national security.
Amen.
It is a matter of national security not to make sure your society is well.
Reverend, half the people on one aircraft carrier, right? They had to take an aircraft carrier and put it into work because everybody got sick.
Exactly. Right?
I mean, you pay $12 billion for a boat, and you don't have the people to operate it because they all got sick.
Right. So that's why
and then they fire the captain when he rings the bell.
That's right. And that's why I said to you the other day, it's going to take in this moment some Congress people and senators. First of all, it's going to take the movement. Like, remember, Teddy Roosevelt told one of the movement leaders, A. Philip Randolph, he said, go out and make me do it. Mm-hmm. It's going to take the movement putting a new face. That's what the 20th is going to do. Mm-hmm. And we're going to put forth an agenda. And we're going to have thousands upon thousands of people digitally from all over the country. And you're going to hear from every segment. We're not going to allow folk to divide poor folk by race and color and creed. We actually going to have white people going to be talking about race and black people that's going to be talking about the economics in Appalachia. Right? We're not playing that game anymore. And we're going to build power, and we're registering people to vote. Did you know that if 5 to 10% of poor and low income people around this country were registered to vote around an agenda and voted, they could change the political calculus even in the South? Yep. Even in the South. And the extremists know that. That's why they work so hard to divide us. So June 20th is going to be about changing the narrative, building power. But we also are going to need some Congress people and some senators who will say, you know, this is my Edmund Pettus Bridge moment. Now, what I mean by that, Johnson was a segregationist, practical segregationist. You know, he said, I got to hold on to the South. After the Edmund Pettus Bridge, Johnson decided that he could not be what he was elected to be. Mm-hmm. He had to be more. He had to be greater. And he said, no matter what, you know, John Kennedy, you know, had some reservations. But after the death of Medgar Evers, and in fact, no, before the death of Medgar Evers, He pushed the Civil Rights Bill, said he was going to push it. Then the March on Washington. Then the death of the set four little girls in Birmingham. And he went all out. Now, he didn't live much longer, but he recognized, Franklin Roosevelt recognized that he had to do some things that folks said before the Great Depression was impossible, because it was Teddy Roosevelt that first started talking about in 1912, if I'm not mistaken. He talked about healthcare and basic living wage, and he called them moral issues in his Bull speech in 1912. But it was Franklin Roosevelt that said, this is the moment. And I believe with everything in me, this is the moment. I've got a lot of people, we've started saying this. This is our new mantra. What if you knew that you only had 48 hours of breath left? And a lot of people, that's where they are. You know, all of us got to think about that for a minute. You know, I have an immune deficiency. You know, I could easily be anywhere from 48 hours to a 0 to 48 hours to a ventilator if that virus was to hit me. So we're saying, let's face this mortality and possibility of it and not run from it. Let's hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope, if you will. Hope doesn't come by going around despair. That's happiness. Hope goes through it. So what if I only had 48 hours? What would I want to use my last breaths for? What kind of world? What kind of healthcare? What kind of living wages? What kind of justice? What kind of providing for the common defense and promoting the general welfare? What would I want to use my breaths for? And then we say, then let's start using them. For those who have died needlessly, for those who may die, and for those of us who for just a moment slow down enough to think about the temporary reality of all of our existence. Why not decide in that moment when all of us are thinking about mortality to embrace it and then say, from this point forward, I'm going to use every breath I have to do the right thing. Whether people listen or not, this is where I'm headed. And that's where people are in the Poor People's Campaign. In this moment.
Right. And what a lesson to live by. And what a close on.
Yes,
Reverend, I am grateful for your leadership, for your friendship, for the example you set. Thank you. Stay well.
Keep fighting.
You too.
Take care now.
Well, everybody, I hope you got a chance to see why I am so inspired by Reverend Barber, humbled that he was be willing to make the time tonight, and hope we all do what we can to answer his call, not just digitally on June 20th for the Digital March on Washington, but to continue to push our structures, our government, our state legislators, our systems of government and civil society to make good on that promise to be all that we can, to be the type of country we believe we are. Thanks so much for joining tonight. Reverend Barber, thank you for your leadership and your example. And everybody else, thanks for tuning in. Stay safe out there.